Thank you, Devaji.
Okay, let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, it's visible. You can see. Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, so today we will be discussing about the development best practices. And first of all, what agenda or what topics we are going to cover today. Uh, Majorly, we will be focusing on UiPath best practices like what naming conventions you need to follow. Uh, then comes the error handling, reusability, workflow design, logging, configurations. Also, you need to think about the security aspects or the compliance aspects of any kind of automation that you build. Lastly, we will be also be seeing some UI automation best practices, as majority of the automations are done on the user interface front. So we will be going through those. And lastly, we also have some general tips and tricks. And lastly, then again, we will be having a quiz and a Q&A round at the last, right? So let's not waste any more time jumping into the topic that why do we need UiPath best practices to be followed, right? So first of all, we need to ensure whenever we are building any kind of automations, quality of any kind of automation workflow is very important. So which is easier to understand. You need to build a automation workflow which is going to be easier to understand for the client, and also easier to maintain and scale those, right? So taking the quality aspect, you have to be consistent in your naming conventions, the modularity aspect, and error handling as well, right? So in terms of quality matters because any kind of production ready code needs to be 100% foolproof, right? In terms of error handling as well as naming conventions that you are following. Second aspect is the maintainability. We also need to ensure that whatever code or whatever workflows we are building, those should be easier to maintain over time. Because many a times we face scenarios like developers need to make some updates in the code because their UI automation changes, or UI interface gets changed, or any kind of process optimizations need to be happening over time. So we need to make sure that whatever workflows that you are building, those should be easier to maintain. Because today you are building one automation for a particular project, tomorrow another developer might join in, and he should be able to go through the workflow, and he should be able to make those necessary changes without having any other background, right? So that's the aspect that we are looking for, maintainability. Third aspect is the scalability. So that's what I was talking about. Whatever code you are building, you need to make sure that uh, that should be foolproof, and that can be easily modified in the near future and adapted for different use cases without having to rewrite the entire logic at once, right? The next aspect is the efficiency. So you need to optimize your workflow in a sense that all your selectors should be dynamic, and also the number of activities that you are building, that should be optimized, and it should not be memory heavy in terms of running the automations. And also you need to make sure that you need to avoid unnecessary delays in your workflow so that your automation runs faster and use fewer resources. Uh, the next aspect is the consistency. Consistency means the same topic which I talked about earlier. It should be easier for other developers to understand and make the necessary changes in your workflow. So if you ensure consistency, the whatever naming convention, whatever error handling, whatever logic you are building, those should be consistent across your entire project. The last aspect is the compliance, which is a very important and topic for any kind of automation workflows that we build. That is, you need to encrypt, you need to ensure that you need to encrypt the entire sensitive data, or whatever password or credentials you're storing, those should be securely stored in automation or orchestrated cloud, and limit the automation workflows so that everyone does not have the access to the workflow that you are building, so that they don't make any necessary changes in the production code that you are building and the bot fails in production, right? So you need to take care of all those aspects. And that's why this UiPath best practices is very important to understand and implement the automation workflows and all these taking all these points into your consideration. So let's start with the naming conventions first. So we were talking about naming conventions and how should we name our variables or arguments in the automation workflow. So first point is you need to name the variables in terms of upper camel case. Upper camel case or Pascal case, what we recommend means that your each word in your variables should start with a capital letter, and that should be consistent across your entire workflows. So no other characters should be coming in between the words that you construct as part of the variable naming conventions. And also, each of the variables should have one purpose only across the automation workflow, right? So if you are building one variable called login credentials or username or password, so you should use that same variable across the entire workflow, and not having multiple variables for storing the same username or storing the same password, right? You can, even if you have multiple usernames, maybe you can use different variable naming convention for each of those if that really matters to you. But otherwise, your variables should have one purpose, and global variables should be minimized as much as possible. And again, another point is variables should be kept to the innermost scope. That means that whatever variables, so you can see in the screenshot over here that we have constructed one variable called is valid payment type, which may be absolutely necessary for one particular scope or one particular aspect of that entire automation. And we should not keep this variable into a global scope, so that that reduces the chances that you won't be having uh, many variables in the variable panel. You can minimize the number of variables you are using for each of the scopes, right? And also meaningful naming convention should be there. Again, lengthy variables you should always avoid. Like if it exceeds 20 characters, you should limit the number of words and try to abbreviate the longer words as much as possible. And again, you can give meaningful variable naming convention. Let's say if you are building a for each activity, and inside that, there can be variable names like index parameter or file. You are iterating through multiple files in a for each loop. So just give valid naming convention, which is meaningful, so that other developers, whenever they see your code, they can understand what is that variable doing in that automation workflow, right? The next one is the Boolean variables. So we always recommend using is parameter or has parameter at the start of the Boolean variable naming convention. And again, you should avoid negative naming conventions like not exist. Let's say this flag you are seeing over here is valid payment type or not. So this is a generic Boolean variable. And you should avoid keeping variable names as is not valid payment type, right? Which is a negative aspect. So you should avoid having those kind of naming conventions. Again, we recommend that data table variable names should have prefix dt at the start or the end to understand that it is a data table variable. Same goes for arguments as well. We recommend upper camel case for arguments like uh, file name or text result or retry number, whatever be it. But you should take into account that whatever argument names you are defining, that should start with a in underscore parameter at the start, or out underscore parameter or IO underscore parameter. So that depends depending upon the direction of that particular argument in a particular workflow, right? So that any other developer, when they see your code or when they see this kind of arguments, they very easily understand that this is an argument being used and not a variable being used. And second aspect, they will also get to know about the input or output direction of that particular argument. You can also use default variables for testing these kind of workflows, but you will be only getting that option to put the default value for the input arguments, and output will be always returned by that particular workflow. You can't set default value for that out argument, but for the input arguments, you can very easily set the default values for testing your automation workflows. But you should make it ensure that you should delete those default values before publishing the project, because in real life project, your default values should be coming from your runtime parameters only, right? And not hard coded inside your arguments panel in your automation workflow. The next aspect is the lengthy argument names should be avoided. Again, this point we covered in the variables naming convention as well, that you should avoid having lengthy argument names. Longer words can be abbreviated as uh, some shorter words, but you should limit again your argument naming convention under 20 words, not more than that. So again, for readability and maintenance purposes, it is recommended not to have too many arguments for a single workflow or a particular reusable component, right? I can give you one example over here. Let me go back to the studio. So let's say for an example, you are building one automation workflow for data entry process, right? And the idea is you should be able to split the workflow into multiple sequences. Like don't uh, rush and build a single sequence having all the activities in a single sequence, but it is always recommended to have separate sequences, and you encapsulate whatever functionalities you are performing for that particular task inside these individual sequence blocks. Now coming to the variables panel, you can very easily go ahead and set multiple variables like this naming conventions, right? But that won't make any sense over here. Like let's say for an example, you should follow your naming conventions. If we say that we are building an automation for reading an input file, it should be like first variable name should be input file, again using camel case, and the absolute scope of this variable should be defined to uh, the read input file scope, right? So I need to put a variable naming convention over here, and the scope should be defined as read input file. That way, this particular variable won't be accessible for other sequences, right? And that way, you are also limiting the number of variables you are seeing when you are clicking on each of the individual sequences. Otherwise, what will happen is if you select one sequence and you will see huge number of variables in the variables panel, and you will yourself get confused within the variables that what variable is being used for which purpose, right? Again, for login application, I can create some variables over here like username and password over here, right? All these should be coming under login to application. So that way you need to build your variable naming conventions. And again, same goes for arguments as well. If it is taking some parameters like IN credentials, you can take in parameter called credentials coming from orchestrator assets or Windows credentials. You can pass those credentials over here and you can perform any operation inside this workflow, right? So this is all about the naming conventions over here. Going back to the slide, uh, the same thing about activities as well. You need to follow certain naming conventions. So whenever you are dragging and dropping some activities, let's say for an example, type into or click activities. So it gives some default title for each of the individual activities, right? If I go to the UiPath Studio once again, so let's say for an example, I am introducing one type into over here, right? And it is giving a generic type into as a title, but each and every activity should have meaningful title over here. That way you will be easy. It will be easier to understand as part of your workflow, or even if tomorrow this automation workflow fails, you will be able to understand where it exactly failed. So let's say for an example, you are performing a type into operation for a username, right? You can give the activity title as type into username, right? And that way tomorrow, if this automation workflow fails, it will indicate that the automation has failed for this particular type into activity, which is titled as type into username. That way, it will be easier to debug. And as well as for the readability aspect, tomorrow, if any new developer sees your workflow, he will be able to understand what this operation is exactly doing, right? So that's what we were talking in this particular slide, that whatever activities you are using as part of your project, you need to rename all the activities and don't leave the default name for the activities. So also you have to ensure that all activities, including the assign or the if statement or a sequence that you are putting in your workflow, all should be renamed to improve the readability and also to facilitate error handling. Uh, the third point gives an example about how you can rename the activities. Like, let's say for an example, you are using a click button activity and you should rename that into click login button, which is specifying that on which button it is performing the click operation. So that's what it mentions. The snapshots over here, you can very well understand how it clearly marks that where it is performing this type into operation, and also from the variable naming convention that it is using some in argument cache in operation, and all the activities should be renamed in this way. That's what we recommend while building any kind of automation workflow. Now, apart from the activities, we also suggest naming conventions for the workflow files as well. So all the workflow files that you are building, you should use upper camel case. And if you are building one workflow for login to SAP or for searching transactions in SAP window, all should be renamed into like SAP underscore login XAML. So we usually suggest that whatever applications you are automating, all workflows should have that prefix at the beginning or the start of the workflow naming conventions. And after that, it should clearly mark what exactly it is operating inside that particular XAML. Like SAP login, you can very well understand it is performing login operation. Again, for search transactions, you can very well understand that tomorrow, if any new developer joins, they will be easily able to go through these workflows and make those necessary changes, right? And we also suggest that whatever workflows you are building, let's say for an example, you are building multiple workflows for SAP, all those should be contained inside the same folder in your workflow folder, right? In the snapshot, you can see that we have built multiple libraries or multiple XAMLs for each of the individual functionalities. So all of them clearly state what exactly operation is being performed inside those XAMLs. Also, for if you want to build any kind of test workflow, so you can name those as test underscore and then the workflow that you are trying to test as part of that particular XAML. And all those should be contained in a test underscore framework in your project workflow. So if I go back to UiPath Studio, again, I can demonstrate this one. So let's say for an example, you are building an automation workflow for SAP login. You can build a sequence over here. And what you have to do is you have to create a new folder over here, and you can name it as SAP, and you can put that particular SAP login under that SAP folder. And after that, you can build multiple such sequences inside that SAP. Let's say SAP search transactions. And all those should be contained inside the SAP. And again, you can build another folder called test underscore framework, which you can use to test any kind of XAMLs inside your workflow. All those should be contained inside the test underscore framework folder. The advantage for using such kind of libraries for each of the application is that you will be able to it will be easier to test those components as well. So tomorrow, if you want to test only that particular functionality, let's say for an example, you want to test SAP login, whether that is happening or not. properly functioning or not, or if any UI changes, this SAP login will only get impacted. So you can make the necessary changes to only SAP login, and that way your code will be foolproof, right? You don't have to again dive deeper into the workflow to see where that login part has been coded and make the necessary changes, right? So it gives you the liberty to make the necessary changes or understand the code, or even to test those particular XAMLs. You can easily invoke this particular SAP login in a test sequence and test it out using your uh, dummy or default values, right? So this is as part of the naming conventions. Now coming to the error handling. So we had a session yesterday about error handling, right? So there can be two types of exceptions. One can be business rule exceptions, which we can say that expected exceptions. And the second one is the system or application exceptions, which we term it as unexpected exceptions, right? Means that any kind of unexpected scenarios happen, like let's say UI changes and your automation is failing. Those kind of exceptions can be categorized as application exceptions. And business rule exceptions are exceptions which can happen or which might happen in future. Like let's say for an example, for a particular day, you did not receive the input file for performing the automations. So those are expected exceptions, and you can code those changes in your workflow in a way that in case the input file is not available, you can throw a business rule exceptions. So for throwing this kind of exceptions, we always suggest that you put proper error message inside the business rule exception. Like if the error message or if the error is happening due to transaction items exceeding the maximum allowed threshold value, you can probably throw a business exception in a way that clearly indicates that what is the exact reason behind that particular failure, right? That way, the business will be able to easily understand the bot, why it is failing, and you can restart the bot, providing the necessary input and tweaking the input so that the bot run is successful and they get the necessary output for that particular automation, right? And again, for business rule exception, we don't recommend to retry a particular transaction, and always you should throw those error messages using throw activities and use appropriate log messages in those particular logic or those particular sequences where this kind of errors are getting captured, because that way it will be easier to understand. Because tomorrow, if an automation workflow fails, you can go to the orchestrator logs and check those log, and you will be easily able to understand what went wrong for that particular transaction, right? So this is as part of business exception. We recommend that you follow proper error messages. You throw proper error messages for each of the exceptions that the bot encounters, right? And for system exceptions, again, it can happen due to application stop responding, or there can be no internet connection for the same. And the best practices is to encapsulate whatever sequences or whatever logic you feel that might fail in future or application gets changed. So let's say for an example, tomorrow you can get an exception around SAP login XAML, which you had built. So if any particular UI element changes, tomorrow your automation workflow might get changed, right? Might get fail. So in that case, it is always recommended to encapsulate those login XAML under a try catch block to catch these kind of application exceptions and throw those exceptions using a proper log message activity for the business to know what went wrong for that particular day in that particular application, right? And again, for application exceptions, it is always recommended to retry the transaction up to 3 times, and all those can be done using set transaction status activity. So if you have a auto retry parameter set in the queue page of orchestrator, so automatically that particular queue item will get retry if you just classify that particular transaction item as application exception, right? Otherwise, if you are not using orchestrator queue, then in that case, you might have to write a logic, like you can introduce retry scope parameter retry scope activity, and you can throw those kind of errors and retry those kind of logic in case an application exception happens, right? Now, some general tips about error handling. We always say that same thing. The logging levels should be properly used in the log message activities. And for any kind of use case where you are not using any orchestrator queue, you can use retry scope activity to retry a particular sequence for a predefined number of times if that particular condition is not met. And always it is recommended to encapsulate the retry scope activity within a try catch block, because retry scope activity usually throws an error if the retry number gets exceeded and if the same application exception happens for that particular sequence. So you need to encapsulate the retry scope within a try catch with a proper log message in the catch section to catch those kind of exceptions where even after retrying 3 times, that particular sequence is failing. And you can send an error message to the business users for this kind of application exceptions. And also you have the facility to introduce a global exception handler, which can be used to retry any particular activity which is failing and which can be created from the project settings parameter. So if I go back to UiPath Studio, let's say for an example, you want to introduce a global exception handler over here. You just need to right click over here. You will get a add option over here, and there you will be having the option to introduce a global handler. And again, for this one, you can introduce global handler for data entry workflow that you are building, right? So this gives you the facility to pass a error message, and this gives an option to choose the next kind of behavior or next kind of steps that you want to perform for any kind of error that is occurring to your automation workflows, right? As a default, it is giving you the option to retry up to 3 times if any particular activity fails in your automation workflow. And using this, passing this parameter, you will be able to retry that particular activity up to 3 times. And if not, if this retry count gets exceeded, that is above 3, then it will abort that particular automation workflow. So this is the beauty of global exception handler. You also need to ensure that wherever possible, if it is necessary, then only introduce global exception handler. Otherwise, go with the try catch block and throw whatever application exception or business exception that you encounter, right? Usually, if you use orchestrator queue, these kind of retry parameters are usually taken care of by just setting the application exception in the queue item, right? Now, the next aspect that we are going to discuss over here is the reusability aspect. Now, what we recommend is whatever modules that you are building, those you need to clearly break those part of sequences into separate workflows. Now, if I go back to the workflow that I was showcasing earlier, so let's say for an example, you have built multiple sequences, right? Like all of these sequences are having different functionalities over here. So you should separate it out as separate workflows. So what you can do is you can right click on each of those sequences and click on the extract as workflow. So what will happen is you will be getting a separate XAML file, which will state that this workflow is going to be used for read input file only. And you can just click on create button over here. And you can see that read input file XAML has been created with only that part of the sequences. And you can create arguments over here, which will be necessary. Like over here, you will be having arguments as input file for reading that particular file, and output. In most of the cases, you will be having output as some data table, right? So you can define those arguments and you can uh, invoke these particular XAMLs inside your automation workflows. So advantage over here is if you invoke these workflows as separate XAMLs, the code will look cleaner. And if tomorrow you have to make any necessary changes into this part of read input file, then you can directly go ahead into this particular XAML and make the necessary changes. You don't need to go inside the sequences and look for the changes that you have to make. And then in that case, again, you have to test it out. You have to test the entire workflow in that case, right? Just to implement one particular change. So if you break it out as a separate XAML, you will be easily able to test it out, test this particular XAML as a separate component, and you can make the necessary changes and implement whatever changes you have to make as part of the automation workflows. So all of these you can extract as workflow, and you can invoke those, right? The code will look cleaner and easier to maintain as well. Now that's what we are mentioning in this particular slide. Like you have to, it is always best practices to keep the business logic separate from the library components. Like, let's say for an example, you are building one workflow to change the customer info. So this change of customer info should not be invoked inside get customer info XAML, right? The reason being,
Accepted.
can you mute yourselves if you are not talking, please? That way we can focus on the session over here. So yeah, what we were saying over here is change customer info should not be invoked from the get customer info. So let's say for an example, first, as a first step, you are getting some customer info from a particular file, and then you are changing those customer info into one particular application, right? So you build two separate XAMLs for that. And your change customer info should never get invoked from inside the get customer info. So the reason being, uh, again, it will be difficult to test those components if tomorrow, if you have to make those necessary change into each of the necessary components. And also as part of the error handling and reusability aspect, we suggest that each of the components or XAMLs should be invoked separately. So in the screenshot over here, you can understand from here that in the second scenario, it has been invoked, the change info workflow inside the get customer info sequence, right? This is not a expected in terms of best practices. Instead, you should always break it into a flow diagram or a flow chart where you first use the invoke get customer info, and then you write some logic, and then depending upon that condition, you invoke the change customer info workflow. That will be easier to maintain, and also from the readability aspect, tomorrow if any new developer joins, they will be easily able to understand what's happening inside that particular workflow, right? So this is from reusability aspect. Next comes the workflow design. So you can understand, or you must have gone through that there are two kinds of workflows that UiPath provides. One is the sequence, and second one is the flowchart. You need to understand when you should use which one, right? Like sequences should be used when you have simple workflow, uh, where you don't have any kind of complicated logic or a complicated condition to satisfy, and everything is happening in a linear fashion. Let's say you are performing some automation in a UI application. So all those activities you can encapsulate within a particular sequence. You can create a sequence and write those steps inside a sequence. And flowchart should be always be used where you have multiple decision points within your workflow. Uh, that way, it is easier to read, and also going through your code tomorrow, a new developer will be easily able to understand where he should make the necessary changes if any changes need to be happening, right? And flowcharts are usually suggested or recommended to be following the same pattern as the to-be diagram that you get in the process definition document for better readability. So also from workflow design aspect, we have some best practices that you should avoid having any kind of nested if conditions. And even if you are using any kind of if conditions, that should not have more than two levels. If it has those kind of complicated nested ifs, it is always recommended to use flowchart and not use a sequence, right? And also use a sequence only when using UI automations and when your entire operations are having a kind of linear fashion and no complicated logic or decision making points. Also, it is recommended to break the workflow into multiple subtasks or sub processes. That's what we talked about in your earlier slides, that whenever you have different set of tasks being performed in a particular process, always break that into multiple workflows and always use separate workflow files for separate sub processes. So this is as part of the workflow design. Now, next aspect is the logging aspect. Now, before moving on to the next slides, I would pause over here for a few moments. If you have any questions over here, uh, you can feel free to ask right now, or if not, we can proceed with the next couple of slides. I understand today's session is a bit more of a theoretical session, but I will try to open my UiPath Studio and try to showcase some of the things if I can, right? But yeah, but please bear with me through this entire theoretical session. And lastly, we will be also be having a QA session and a quiz session, uh, which you can take part, and we will be announcing the winners, right? So any questions so far, whatever we discussed till now? Okay, so I would take it as no. Let me proceed to the next parts. Like next is the logging aspect. So as part of logging, we also follow some best practices. Whenever you are building an automation workflow, or let's say SAP login, or in this example, you can say see UI demo add transaction workflow. You should put appropriate log message at the start and as well as the end of the workflow, right? Which clearly indicates that this particular workflow has started. So let's say for an example, in this particular screenshot, you can see that it is stating that starting new transaction. And once that workflow completes, it is also notifying that through a log message, transaction has been added. And whatever the output parameters, it is printing in the log message activity only, right? And whatever operations you are performing, that should be inside a particular sequence in your workflow, so that tomorrow, if any particular error you encounter in this particular XAML or in this particular workflow, you will be easily able to understand that whether this particular add transaction workflow was started or not at the first place. And then you can dive deeper into the root cause of what went wrong for that particular error message, right? So that's what we are saying, that log message activities should be used to trace a running process for diagnosing and debugging that particular automation workflow. And it is always, as part of best practices, it is always recommended to have appropriate log level. So if you are notifying through log message that this particular workflow has been started, you should put appropriate log message like info. And also, if you are catching any kind of exception in the catch block, you should put log level as error. Also, a business rule exception, whenever it is thrown, you should put the log level as error and not any kind of info. Uh, Also, whenever you are reading any data from any external sources, chances will be there that the file is not available or some data format gets changed, right? So after reading that particular data from that particular external source, you should put a log message that this file has been read successfully, and whatever number of rows it has read, you can print those as part of log message, so that going forward, if any issue happens while reading that particular file, you'll be easily able to understand what went wrong, whether the file has been read successfully or not, and accordingly you can dive deeper into the root cause. Also, for using a parallel branch, whenever you are using a parallel branch for activities, so you can put log level as information. That way you will be easily able to understand which particular branch got triggered for which particular course of action. And whenever you are using any if statement or flowchart decisions or a switch case or a flow switch, in those cases as well, put appropriate log message for each of the cases that you are going to build. Now, this is as part of logging. Also in the screenshot, you can see that proper annotations have been provided, like what functionality is being performed as part of that particular XAML, precondition, post action, whatever condition need to be present for that particular XAML to run, you can put proper annotations for each of those cases, like precondition and post action. That way it will be, so tomorrow if any new developer joins, they will be easily able to understand what this operation or what this workflow is doing, and what is the expected output out of this particular XAML, and what is the condition for running this particular automation workflow, right? Next, as part of the configurations, we should also focus upon some of the configurations, like it can be credentials, it can be file path while reading any particular file, it can be URL while reading or navigating any particular web application. You might have some URLs. So those you can store as part of the configurations. So storing of configurations can happen either in orchestrator asset or in the config file, or you can put it in inside some kind of JSON file uh, for those particular attributes which are never going to change. So that's what we are stating over there, like configurations which never change, such as static selectors or application labels. You can hard code or you can store it in some kind of JSON file in your automation workflow. Next is the configurations which are unlikely to change, but can get changed going forward. Like let's say for an example, tomorrow, wherever the business users today puts their input files, if the file path gets changed, then your automation workflow will be failing, right? So those kind of things you can either store in assets or in the config file. So we recommend that whatever config parameters which are unlikely to change, you can store in the config file. And configurations which are likely to change, like let's say for an example, some URL parameter or credentials, those can get changed, and you can use orchestrator assets for storing those parameters which are likely to change. Also, there can be some kind of runtime settings which can be set during the runtime, like it can be based upon some data points in your input file. You might have to take some kind of decisions. So those you can store as part of orchestrator queue items for unattended robot, right? And for attended robot, you can use input dialogues for the same. Next part is the configurations. You can also have some configurations where you have to store multiple credentials for different robots. So for those kind of cases, you can leverage orchestrator asset. So orchestrator asset has that functionality where you can store per robot values. You can define configurations for each of the robot, whatever configurations you want to store. Like it can be login credentials, it can be anything, right? You can store as part of orchestrator assets with per robot values. Now, there can be also scenarios where you want to allow some changes in the input data uh, without developer intervention. So for those kind of things, we suggest that you need to store the configurations as part of orchestrator asset or the config file, right? So this is as part of configurations best practices that we recommend. Again, depending upon use case to use case, you might have to store configurations at different places, but try to stick to this kind of pointers that we are discussing over here, and make it a standard going forward, that whenever you are implementing such automations, ensure that you are storing the credentials or whatever parameters might get changed tomorrow inside orchestrator assets or inside the configuration file. Next, as part of the security, also we have to store the credentials. So for storing of credentials, there are two options that you have. One is the orchestrator credential assets, which is the most recommended option. And if orchestrator is not available for any particular use case or any particular client, then you can leverage Windows Credential Store, right? And for storing or fetching the credentials from orchestrator asset, you can use get credential activity, and whatever variables you are using for storing those kind of credentials, it should be secure string data type and not any kind of string or plain text, right? You should not store the credentials inside any kind of plain text, because that is totally unethical and against the compliance of most of the clients. And second one is the Windows Credential Store, where you can use get secure credential activity for fetching the credentials. Also, you need to make sure that the scope of the credential variables, whatever you are using over here, those should be limited to whatever sequence or whatever workflows that you are using. You should not uh, set the scope of this credential variable as a global variable, right? So, so all those things you need to be very mindful while using the credentials. Now, this part is the annotations part or the comments part, which we already discussed. Like whenever you are building any kind of automation workflow, you should put proper description. You should put proper arguments list that that particular workflow is ingesting, and whatever precondition and post condition, whatever conditions need to be met for that particular workflow to run, you should clearly write in the annotations. So for writing of annotations and comments, let me go back to the workflow over here. Let's say for an example, this is the login application over here. So you can right click over here, and under annotations, you will find add annotations. And over here, you can write the entire description or whatever arguments you have, input arguments or output arguments, all you can mention in this uh, annotation sections. Also, you can have separate comment activity as well, which you can use to clearly indicate some operations which you are performing. But generally, it is recommended not to use comment, but instead of comment, always use log message and annotations. Uh, with two of these conditions, the developer will be able to understand whether they can use this workflow as part of their automation workflow or not, or wherever if any changes need to be happening for that particular workflow, they will be easily able to understand where they need to make those necessary changes. Also coming to the next part, that is the UI automation, we suggest some best practices like you should avoid having delays uh, or whatever delays you are putting inside your workflows should be inside the config file, and not use any kind of hard-coded delays. That will be, you should always use delay parameters, which is easier to configure. And tomorrow, if you have to make any necessary changes in the delay parameter, you can just change the config file. So let me showcase you one such config file where we usually do such kind of delays. Config files are usually stored inside the data folder, and you can have multiple delay parameters inside the constants tab in the config file uh, with different parameters. Like let's say for an example, timeout short, timeout medium, and timeout long. You can set different values for each of the timeouts. The advantage for not hard coding inside your automation workflows is that tomorrow going forward, if you have to make any changes inside the delay parameter because your application is running faster, then in that case, you have to go through your entire workflow, find out where that particular click operation or where that type into is happening, and you have to change the delay parameter over that particular activity. Rather than that, if you just use a variable which is reading the config file, this kind of constants value from the timeout, and if you just use the variables instead of using the hard-coded values, you can just change the config setting inside the configuration file and have that particular delay implemented, right? That way it will be easier to maintain as well. And if any particular error happens due to this delay parameter, you can very easily configure those. And always it is recommended, instead of delay parameter, whenever you are performing any kind of UI automation, you should always go ahead with element exist or text exist or find element or these kind of activities instead of hard-coded delays, because these kind of activities will enable you to search for a particular UI element, and if that particular element is available, only then you will be proceeding with the next particular steps in the automation workflow, right? So that will be more dynamic. So tomorrow, if your automation or application responds in an unexpected manner, you don't know when that a particular pop-up will be appearing, and then inside that pop-up, you have to perform a particular click operation. So using this particular element exist, you can very easily understand when that pop-up will appear, and you can give a timeout to that element exist activity and perform the necessary steps, right? So this is as part of delays. And next part is the UI automations are always recommended to be performed in background, because many a times it happens that the desktop where the bot is running, uh, another human user is also sharing the same desktop application, right? So in that case, it is always recommended to perform your click operations or type into operations in the simulate type or simulate click. This kind of settings in the click into activities will enable you to run the automations in the background mode, meaning that tomorrow, if that particular application is minimized, bot can still run in the background inside that particular application by the help of these particular settings. So again, it is always recommended for any kind of data entry operations. You should use set text, check, or select item activities. Again, get text, get full text, and web scraping. All these activities run in background. So you should rely on this kind of activities rather than the other activities that you have, like get OCR text or get screen text. Those kind of activities usually run in the foreground. Uh, Also, you need to ensure that use element exist wherever necessary to verify the application state before proceeding to the next steps in the automation. That way, your automation will be dynamic and you will be able to perform the automations in a seamless manner. Again, as part of the selector, we also have some kind of best practices. That is, you also need to ensure that you use attributes which are steady and meaningful, and you need to make sure that remove all the attributes which are having all wildcards in a particular attribute name, which does not contribute any particular search of that particular UI element. And also, you will be encountering many a times that a particular selector is having IDX parameter. So IDX parameters are having values like 1, 2, 3, whatever dynamic. So those are not static in most of the cases. So you should avoid using IDX parameter and rely on attributes which are more steady and which are more meaningful for that particular UI element. And we also have an example over here, like let's say for an example, you are clicking on a calendar icon, and calendar is having this kind of date parameter in a particular title value. So this selector will not work if tomorrow this particular date gets changed, right? So always use wildcards in such cases where your title or any particular attribute is having the date parameter in it, or any particular dynamic value is in it. So you just put a wildcard over there, which is a asterisk mark. Using that parameter, you can keep your selector as dynamic as possible. And also, you can leverage dynamic selector dynamic selector, meaning that many a times it happens that you are iterating through a row in a particular UI uh, table, right? DOM table. So there you will be having some table column or table row parameter in the selectors. So you can use variable names inside that. So, and you can iterate through each of the variables over here. So for each of the table columns or each of the table rows, you will be able to iterate. So instead of hard coding the row or column parameters inside the selectors, you can use dynamic selectors, which leverages the variable names directly. So yeah, again, for some of the best practices that we usually suggest is, which you can see, say some tips and tricks that there can be scenarios where you have to perform some operations iteratively. That is, let's say for an example, you are iterating through a particular data table, and for each of the rows, you are performing some operations inside one particular application. So it is always recommended to log in to that particular application outside of that iteration logic, because your login should happen only once. And once that entire iteration process recursively has been completed, you should close the application at the completion of the particular workflow. So meaning that your login of application or launching of application should happen outside the for each loop that you are building for that particular automation workflow, right? You should not log in or launch an application multiple times, because that will be making your code more inefficient, you can say. And also your chances of failure will be increased if you launch an application multiple times and perform some operations inside it. So so opening of application should only happen once at the start. And also after the process gets completed, you need to make sure whatever applications you are leveraging inside that particular automation workflow, you should close all the applications after the robot interacts with those particular applications. And for Excel automation, we usually recommend to use workbook activities instead of Excel scope, because for Excel scope, your Excel application should be installed on your machine. If that is not installed, your Excel scope will not work. So it is always recommended to have workbook activities. Uh, but there can be chances where you might have to invoke Excel scope as well. Let's say for an example, you are running an automation for a macro. So those will require Excel to be installed on your machine. So that particular use cases, you can use Excel scope, but for others, it is recommended to use workbook activities. And also in case, if your process requires an Excel output or Excel report, you need to make sure that Excel or updating of Excel report should not happen inside your transaction level, meaning whenever you are iterating through each of the transactions, you should not update the Excel report during runtime, but you can store and build a data table at the iteration process. And after the for each loop, you can probably update that entire data table which you created inside that for each loop, so that the updation of Excel report will be happening only once, right? And also it is recommended to minimize the use of try catch as much as possible unless it is required. So let's say for an example, you are reading a particular data table. So in the screenshot over here, you can see one particular example. You are performing an operation on a data table. A select operation is being performed. So tomorrow, if it happens that this data table is empty, so this assign clause over here will fail. So what you can, you probably will go ahead with a try catch block for this particular assign activity. But it is always recommended to minimize the use of try catch, because over here you can easily check the number of rows in the data table before proceeding to this kind of select operations in a data table, right? So that way you will be having uh, less usage of try catch, because try catch, uh, most of the cases, it takes the memory consumption and it makes your process more inefficient. So the more you use your try catch, the uh, more, it will put your workflow at a more riskier level, and you will be having the chances of throwing exceptions, right? And also in case of UI automations, let's say for an example, you are performing a click operations. So it is always recommended to use a element exist or check app state, which is in the modern design, to check for that particular element and then perform the UI automations, and not use try catch for those simple click operations, right? And lastly, whenever you are publishing or whenever you are done with the automation, it is always recommended to remove any kind of unused dependencies through the dependency manager, and always clean up the unused variables or the unused arguments which you might create during your workflow creation, and use the workflow analyzer to check the any kind of naming conventions or whatever standards, whether you have met all the coding standards or naming conventions or not. So you can easily create your own custom rules as well as part of the workflow analyzer settings, and you can check those. You can run the workflow analyzer to check whether you have met all the conditions or not. Otherwise, it will not allow you to publish the automation. So that brings us to the end of the best practices usage over here. So before proceeding, if you have any other questions from anyone, feel free to ask.
So anyone can ask any question regarding today's session.
Okay, if not, we can jump into the quiz session over here. I think,
I have one question, Sinha.
yeah, please go ahead.
The session is very good. We learned a lot of things from it. Is there any GitHub link where we can see the projects which are developed so that we can learn fastly from them?
You can go through a use case repository that will be having a lot of use cases regarding what kind of automations are usually being built. Abhishek or Apurva will ping you the link of the use case repository. And apart from that, if you want to go through some codes, you can. So the library components which we were talking about earlier, right? Like let's say for an example, SAP login or this kind of reusable components. So all those components are available in UiPath Marketplace. So if you go into the UiPath Marketplace, you will be able to access those codes. You can download those. You can go through the workflows that have been built. But again, for whatever production ready codes that we build using usually for the automation use cases, those are usually maintained at the client place. But you can go through the library components to understand how you can build the libraries.
Thanks, Sinha. Thanks.
Welcome. So I think Abhishek has already pinged you the Menti link. But again, this is the QR code that you have. You can scan this QR code and you will be able to access the Menti quiz. Just give me a minute. Let me start the Menti quiz session so that you can access the questions. Can you please let me know if you are able to access the quiz sessions?
No.
Yeah, it's now
Just
open.
Yeah, it's
Otherwise,
accessible.
you can check now. Yeah.
Yeah, now we can access it.
Okay. Just let me know if you, once all of you are able to access Menti. Okay, then I will start the quiz round. We have 17 participants. I think, let me start. Okay, so first question is, which is the most recommended option in UiPath to store the credentials in an automation workflow? You have 10 seconds. Okay, so we got the vote from everyone. So let me also discuss the answers right away over here. So UiPath always recommends to store the credentials as part of orchestrated credential assets, while you can also store the credentials in the Windows credential, but usually best practice is to store the credentials inside orchestrator. Next question is going to be, where should you store the configurations of an automation workflow, which are unlikely to change in the future? Option 1 is orchestrator assets. Option 2 is hard-coded inside the workflow. Option 3 is config file. Okay. Yeah, so the config file is the right answer over here, because you should only use assets when the parameters are more likely to change. But when the question comes like it is unlikely to change in future, very rarely you have to change those parameters. You can put those inside the config file. So the config file is easily accessible for the developers, while the assets are accessible for the process owners as well. And they can also easily change those asset parameters. But whenever the question comes like it is rarely going to change in future, then you can use the config file.
Hi, Sinha. Like later, you can explain more about if
Yeah, sure.
business owners can access the or change the assets you said, right?
Yeah, if you need a scenario where the business user want to change the assets, then you can store in config, then you can store in the asset parameter. But otherwise, if
That
it
is in the
is
orchestrator, right? You mean to say?
orchestrator assets, yes, yes. And second one is the config file. Config file should be only be used when it is really supposed to change, right? So you don't need to have too many assets in the orchestrator. That's what we usually recommend.
Thank you.
Okay, so next question. While automating login to an application, in case the login fails due to invalid credentials, what will be your next steps? First option is trigger system exception and retry the transaction. Second option, trigger business exception and retry login. Third option is trigger business exception and send email to process owners. And fourth option is trigger system exception and send email to process owners. So sixth option will be the correct option. You need to trigger a business exception email in this particular case and notify the process owners. There's no point in retrying these particular cases, because even if you retry, it is still going to fail since the login credentials has got expired. Okay, question 4. Next question is, which workflow type would you use to automate process which involves multiple decision points? Option 1 is sequence and option 2 is flowcharts. Yeah, so correct option is in this case flowcharts. Majority has gone that right. Sequence should only be used where you have linear course of actions and you have minimal number of decision points. In that case, you can use sequences, but otherwise flowcharts gives a more visual representation of all the conditional logics that you design or code in your workflow. The last question for you is going to be, in SAP application, a pop-up appears after entering the account number. Now you have to select the recommended option from the below about how you can handle this particular scenario. Option 1 is you can use delay activity and close the pop-up and proceed. Option 2 is you can use element exist and check the Boolean flag to proceed. Option 2 is the correct option. In this case, you have to use element exist because that will make your code more dynamic, and you should always avoid using delay activities or hard-coded delays. Because tomorrow, if the application starts responding efficiently, then you have to change the delay parameter. Then a lot of code changes will be required in that case, right? Okay, so that brings us to the end of the quiz session. Let's see who is the winner for quiz of best practices. Chetan is the winner. Congratulations, Chetan.
Lessons.
I can see second runner-up as Aruna and Arijit. Well done. I think all of you have done
Is it
really
okay if
good.
you can come on the video? Sorry, I'm interrupting Devajyoti, but Chetan,
Sure,
if you
sure.
will be able to turn on.
Okay, I have to share my screen, right? You want to take a screenshot of this?
Yeah, I had taken the screenshot. I thought if
Okay.
in case he is available and it's not working. Okay, no, not an issue, Chetan. Anyway, congrats and not an issue. Thank you.
Congratulations, Chetan. Also, others as well who participated in this quiz session. All of you has done really well. Just going through the best practices and after that attempting this quiz session. The questions were a bit tricky, but you did really good job. Thank you, everyone. And if anyone has any kind of questions, please, I'm ready to answer those questions.
I'm asking something, Devajyoti, if you do not mind.
Yeah, sure, Jay. Yeah, go ahead.
I know it's just taking this opportunity. I know this code review part, right, which is very essential from the best practice perspective as well, because when we do code review for a fellow team member or fellow developer hours, I think these are the very basic and important topics that you covered today. So I guess if you can just share a little bit about your experience about how this code review happens, why this is also an important aspect with our audience, little bit which is related to what we have covered today. I think that might be helpful for certain people to understand.
Correct. So whenever we build any kind of automations, so you need to understand there are developers who are developing the automations. Then we have solution architects. Then we have the project managers, right? So that's our responsibility as part of solution architect. We usually perform a code review before publishing any kind of automation workflow into production. So that's as part of our roles and responsibilities. We go through the code, we ensure, so whatever we discussed today, right? All those naming conventions, all those coding standards should be met. Also, the try, catch, delay, all these are very important parameters. And also from the security aspect, the storing of credentials is a very important aspect. We go through those details in the code walkthrough, and we perform a detailed review sessions to understand whether that code is foolproof and whether proper exception handling is there, and also the naming convention, whether that has been followed or not. So we usually have a checklist to go through what conditions have been met, and we assess whatever developers develops the code. We go through the code and try to assess that and try to give us coding parameter as well, that whether that particular code has met the condition to be pushed into production. Only after our approval, so if that all the conditions has been met, we push that particular code into production environment. So you need to understand whenever you will be going onboarded into any particular organization, you need to be very mindful of all these things. whenever you are implementing any kind of automation workflow, you need to ensure proper try-catch mechanism should be there, proper naming convention should be followed, and delay parameters should be handled correctly, and also the security and the credentials, which is a very important topic. So we usually check those things are being taken care of in the automation workflow or not. If not, we ask the developer to rewrite that logic once again, right? So you can very well understand, as a developer, it is your responsibility to write a foolproof code which gets published into the production workflow. Because also we have to follow a kind of timeline for publishing any kind of development workflow, right? So if you have to, again, after code review, if I go give the code back to you and ask you to rewrite the entire logic, then it will obviously take time from your end. So you need to ensure whatever code you are building, that is foolproof from your end, so that it gets published into the production environment. I think, Jay, I covered most of the
Yes,
things
yes,
over here.
yes,
but
you covered pretty well. Thank you so much for that. I guess, like this is one of the aspect which is very critical to the position that you mentioned, even from my perspective. And I believe everyone in this call, hope all of you are able to understand. But yes, if you have an additional question, go ahead and ask the questions. But you covered it, Devajyoti, pretty well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, please ask if you have any questions from your end.
Hey, just had one question.
Hey, hi.
So
Yeah.
I know there are some risks in that the code could have infinite loops if the retry mechanisms are not well configured, right? And like in flowchart. How about in sequence? Is there any risk that to use for each activity that could lead into an infinite loop, as well as in the retry mechanism?
Yeah, so whenever you are performing any kind of recursive operation or any kind of iteration logic, you should always ensure the object or the data table on which you are performing that kind of iteration logic. Best practices is to check the number of rows that particular data table operation you have, right? That's what I talked in the one of the slide, that you have to ensure that instead of putting a try catch, you just have to ensure that whether that particular data table contains any kind of rows or not. And after that, you start your iteration logic. And for each loop, usually it iterates depending upon the number of row count you have. So very less chances of infinite loop, but try to avoid the do while logic or those kind of iteration logics where you don't have any count and you increment one particular counter and perform an iteration logic, right? So that's again comes under one of the code review. Thanks for pointing it out. But yeah, we usually go through those aspects as well, whether those particular things are being taken care of while using a do while, and always for each is recommended. And if you have to implement a do while logic, make sure that index counter or whatever condition you are putting inside that while condition should be foolproof, and it should not go into the infinite logic.
Okay, thank you.
So anyone else have any question?
Hey Dibajati, hi, Shovarna this side. Utilizing this session, I just want to ask one thing.
Yeah,
so
sure.
actually, like say there are some cases, right? Say for example, if we are dealing with a password protected file, so that could be a PDF or an Excel file. So the input that the UiPath service expects, I mean, whatever service you are using, right? So read PDF or I mean Excel application scope, the input that it expects is a plain text password. So what we do in that case is generally when we fetch the credential from orchestrator, we do convert it into plain text password using a new network credential then dot password, right? But say we don't want to make that, available in orchestrator logs or any other logs. So maybe one thing we can do is we can directly go to the activity property and mark that private as a check as true. But then that
Correct.
might lead to some other consequences. Like suppose if I want to say inside an Excel application scope, I want to log something. Say this is the row value after doing this. Suppose I'm doing something like that. Then those kind of loggings will not be visible anymore because I have marked the entire property as private Excel application scope. So whatever log I put inside that will not work. So I mean, what would be your suggestion in this case? How do we handle this? Or I mean, is there any other best practices that you would recommend while we try to deal with this? I just want to get your understanding.
Right. So for using of credentials, there are two aspects.
Okay.
One, there can be scenarios where you can directly use the secure credentials, right? Secure string. Second aspect is the string parameter, which you might have to use in some of the cases, like it can be in case of SMTP email messages as well. You have to pass it as a plain text or a string, right?
Yes.
So that kind of cases we usually suggest, you can store it in some kind of variable, but minimize the scope of that variable to just that particular activity. Don't put a global variable and don't print those particular variables in any kind of log message, right? So you should not print any sensitive data, even not password, even apart from passwords, you should not store details like account info or amounts or whatever revenue details for a particular organizations. You should not print those sensitive data in the log message. So one is you should not print those in log message, but you can use string variables, but that string variable should be limited or defined to that particular activity only. You can put just a sequence just for fetching that particular password and put that scope inside that particular sequence only and not a global scope, right?
Yeah, and maybe then we can mark that as private so that it will be limited only to that and it will not be even logged in verbose level, right? Great.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that explanation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No problem. Yeah. I think everyone got bored after this entire best practices session and their faces look so serious. I mean, so this is our last session. You can feel free to ask, or if you have any feedback about the Automation Vidyalaya sessions, feel free to shoot it out. Okay. We will be coming up with more such sessions. I think Apurvo already has such plans. We will be also planning some meetup as well. Let me see if I can join going back to Kolkata, because currently I'm located in Bangalore. But yeah, I will definitely ensure that I will join any kind of virtual or any kind of sessions that we arrange.
Hi.
Hey, hi.
This one small query. If we consider other automation apart from UiPath, while we check for the errors, okay? We are connected to different VMs and we go or we check from the control room itself, like how orchestrator, we check from the control room, we debug the code. And for sure, we'll be having the latest code, whatever the developers have done or they push the code. What will be the scenario like in the UiPath, how it will be like, while we debug or anything, like how we can picturize that, we don't have any.
Right. So usually how it happens is in a production environment, your service accounts will be configured and there usually UiPath Studio are not being installed. So you should not debug any kind of automation workflow in the production environment, right? So how it usually is being followed in the current best practices scenario is if any kind of error or any kind of issue happens, the support team is going to raise an incident, and based on that incident, that the QA team will reach out, or whatever the subsequent assignee or the assignee team, they will be there will be a separate level or the staging environment where they pull the code from the production environment and recreate the scenario and try to test it out. If the issue that has been raised, whether it is correct or not, and make the necessary changes, right? And if any development changes need to happen, then again a separate environment will be there, like a dev environment, a separate VM will be there, where you can pull the code from the prod, the latest code, and make the necessary changes and push it into the QA and then correspondingly the production environment. Does that answer your question or?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I got it. But there's one more thing. Like when you said it is not recommended to debug, I understand. Like we take a release and we do it. But in current scenarios, we have different levels, like you have mentioned, like based on L1, L2, L3 levels. Like it goes according
Yep.
to when we rise the right incident and we work around. When you say like pulling the release or the latest code, that's from the orchestrator only, right?
Yeah, orchestrator or any GitHub repository that you source code repository you might be having, right? From there, you have to pull the code and test it out accordingly.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for giving an picturization of it. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
Team, I have one thing. So few of you are who are everyday joining, right? So and you have everyday seen how the sessions are going on and how we conducted all these things. So this is the first time we conducted the sessions in this huge scope. Okay, and the scope is the scope includes itself for the students, the basic RPA developers who have just done a few you can say that a few development practices as well. So but if you have any feedback for us, so it will be very much helpful for all of us just to conduct these sessions in the near future. So please feel free, and as we are in front of you, don't hesitate to do give any negative feedback as well. Okay, so if you have any negative feedback, please say in front of us so that it will be helpful for us in the near future as well.
We are expecting more from you, from your team, more sessions like this. You know, it was sorry to take up. I just took the unmuted the mic. It was very good session, but we had a tough call, like working hours and again joining back in a short period of 2 hours, and maybe like not bachelor people, family people, like we'll have a lot of other things like every day 10 o'clock. It's like having a plate in front of us, and we'll be having the dinner and listening the session and attending the quiz. We expect more on advanced like RE framework if it is coming from your team, especially. I like this Kolkata chapter. It was amazing. The team was great, supportive, and everyone was it's super. That's it. I can say. So
Okay,
we expect more on orchestrator and RE framework side.
okay, sure. We are having a plan just to include orchestrator and RE framework in the near future, but definitely we will be coming this session.
Sorry to
virtual.
request for more, even if it goes a step ahead with UiPath apps as well as we'll be needing it. Sure.
So you are from Kolkata?
No, I'm from Bangalore. I was very happy when Sinha said he's from Bangalore. I think I'm the only.
No, he is from Kolkata only, but he is currently located in Bangalore.
That's nice.
Due to his office work, yeah.
Nice to hear.
Anyone else?
Hi, this is Ramakrishna.
Yeah, Ram.
I have been attending your sessions, and they are very good and very friendly for presentation for the beginners. And I like to see the advanced sessions that the person said now. And I have taken the paid courses also, but there whatever you are covering in free, like PDF automation or email automation and anything that you covered, those are very value than the paid ones. So, so because
that means a lot.
people are taking more. I have joined a course. They're charging me for basics 13,000 rupees, but not even then covering all the basic concepts in that course. That's what I felt after attending your sessions. I stopped attending the paid ones. Now I'm learning myself with the help of like you people. Thank you very much.
Got it. Thank you for sharing your experience. Anyone else?
That's a great compliment, I would say. And we have just started, right? And this kind of compliment really boosts up. So probably we will be having more such sessions. And yeah, it's always better to attend these sessions in person or joining the session virtually as well, right? Rather than just watching the recordings. That's what I iterated in the beginning as well. So if you join
Yeah.
the sessions virtually or attend the sessions virtually, that time you will be having a lot of queries, and you can ask the queries to the facilitator as well, or the speaker as well, right? So they will be able to help you out.
Yes, that will give attention also, full attention when we are in live now. So we'll
Yes,
focus
yes.
on with full mind. Otherwise, the recordings will go on the other side. We'll grab only half of the knowledge from the records.
Right, right. And I think we have a good WhatsApp group as well where people are quite active, I can see. So let's make uh, good use of all the resources that we have.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, anything from the college going students, what they have leveraged from this session. Anyone, Dave, Santanu, Priyanshu, anyone can say.
Actually, the thing is, I was busy with some stuff, so I'll better watch the recordings. But it would have been really great if I would have joined the live sessions. But I'll manage with the recording sessions as well.
Yeah, just one suggestion: maintain the pace.
Yeah. That's.
Yeah, anyone else?
Priyanshu, you can share your views. You had attended the sessions, right?
Are you finding the button for unmuting?
Okay, no issue.
I'm just
What is the question you asked? Can you come again? Can you come again? The question, can you repeat it again?
No, that's not a question. Actually, Priyanshu, you can continue. He was just saying that he is finding the unmute button.
Oh, okay. Okay. Good. Sorry, I was driving now, so I joined in driving.
No, I have attended the session. The session was really good. Sometimes I have missed. I think I have missed 2 sessions. I can manage with the recordings as well. And please try to arrange this type of session regular. I think this is not possible regularly based. I think sometimes for 2 months or 3 months we can arrange this type of session. Then it would be better for us.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Hey Apurva, Shubham here.
Hi, Shubham.
Yeah, it's an amazing learning experience basically from your end. What you conducted, basically the full Automation Vidyalaya series. I have been attending from the past first session, so it's a beautiful journey from the first. I would say it's better to attend this type of session rather than just studying from the UiPath Academy. That would I say, because from here basically I get the real insights.
True. And you will be having someone in front of you just to ask you a question randomly, right? But in academy, you don't have the opportunity to ask the question. So that's a good point. Yeah.
Exactly.
Anyone having sorry, please carry on.
Yeah, so exactly instant insights we will get basically through this type of session. So it's better to arrange this type of sessions in a certain interval that would complement our certification study basically.
Got it. Anyone would like to put any suggestion for any improvement kind of thing?
Yes, if we can arrange a chapter meet in Kolkata, then it would be better, I guess.
Okay. Definitely we'll be having it.
I want to give a suggestion.
Sure.
Like you gave us one homework type. So after every session, if we have homework and then upload it on GitHub, so it will not only save us that as a project, but also increase our learning process. and help
Okay.
us to understand it.
Okay. Okay. Noted. Thank you so much for the suggestion, Priyanshu and Deb.
Yeah, for this, we can create a repository of UiPath Kolkata community chapter, and there all can share the projects there, the homeworks that he was saying right now. So that
Okay.
would be better. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for the suggestion. We'll think about it for our repository. We'll do it. I'm just noting it down. Anyone, any good feedback, any negative feedback, any suggestion? This is the last time we are meeting in this series, okay? So don't hesitate to speak. Krishnendu is there from the very beginning.
We have
Anything?
a active WhatsApp group. We will shoot our questions everything.
We know.
Soon we'll be shooting a lot there.
We know. But one more thing, so without the funny thing, so the thing is, so as you have, it means many of you are there from the very beginning, right? So you can share your experience on LinkedIn. You can tag any one of us, means as per your choice. Okay, so for every speaker, every moderator, you can just tag, and you can share the experience on LinkedIn, so that we will be having a better exposure over there. Okay, so this is not only one chapter in the whole world, so there are many more chapters. Okay, so probably we are having more than hundreds of chapters throughout the world. Okay, so you can just share your experience with Automation Vidyalaya. You can post in any social media. You can just post on LinkedIn as well as a best platform for all of us. You can tag any one of us, tag any community manager you know, or any other friends you know. So you can just tag any college, anything. Okay, you can tag and you can share your experience, so that will give us a better exposure to that.
Sure, sure.
Great. So we are having our senior people like Dibuyati, Joy, Satyajit. I think Mustaqda is also there.
Yes.
So any closing note?
Eh,
The
there is-
bigger people.
Actually, there is like I will be the best person to give any closing notes so far. I frequently check LinkedIn. I have seen lots of posts are coming. Specifically, I have seen posts from Srikant. I have seen posts from Krishndu. They are working very hard. On the contrary of the last discussion we had yesterday, that if the fresher has a good opportunity or not. Yes, we have, but again, I will just suggest to take the right path to reach out to the right um, uh, like right thing. So it's better. UiPath has a good platform and a good competency over the market, over other products. So you can learn it through, and there are different components from like process gathering to deployment. So go through each of the components. Maybe we'll be coming with the Automation Vidyalaya 2.20 with some advanced training in coming days. But there are already different documents and videos and KTs are available over UiPath Academy and as well as YouTube. Go through it. We are all connected within a particular group in WhatsApp, so we can like ask our question if we have any specific question around it. That is all from my side, Apurva.
Okay, so
Apurva?
yeah, please.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, actually, this is a suggestion from my end. It's better to keep a session regarding the sample questions, okay, of a particular certification exam, so that one can complement his certification preparation study or something like that.
Okay.
Like certification terms I'm talking about. It's if it's possible.
Yeah, got it. Thanks for the suggestion. I'm noting.
Answering to Suham, if you want to clear the certification, definitely you have to get the concepts clear first. Okay, the terms. If you go with the terms, it won't help you. Okay, because they don't repeat the questions. Firstly, second is once you clear the concept, then only you'll be able to answer the questions that they formulate from their end. Okay, UiPath from UiPath ends. So better first we get the concepts clear for each of the components, and then do some do some sample questions, go through them so that we are able to understand the type of questions, but definitely not mark them up and expect that okay those questions will definitely come and we'll be able to answer it in seconds.
No, actually, I'm talking about like after clearing the concepts, we can, keep a session regarding sample questions, like how the questions will be going to come in the examination so that one can complement his study. So that I'm talking about.
Yeah, right. So if you, okay, so for if you're talking about some sample questions, which will help us understand that how, what kind of questions can come for the different type of certifications, then definitely.
Yeah, that's
we
what I'm talking.
do that.
I think there are some online resources for the practice sessions.
I'm not aware about that.
Okay. We'll search and provide that to you. Yeah, just Google it. You will find something. Otherwise, we will provide that.
Anyone from today's
Sure.
audience has completed all of the sessions? Many or only few?
Yes, I have completed all the sessions from starting to end.
Nice. Maybe I really do not know how much value we have added to your knowledge, but I have gone through the curriculum we have designed so far from our UiPath Kolkata chapter. It is a good kickstart for the fresher, and not only the fresher, but who is aspiring to the advanced level of the UiPath, who is approaching towards. We do not have much thing pending on UiPath Studio apart from this RE framework. So once we are completed with RE framework or customized RE framework, we are almost completed with the UiPath Studio things. Rather, environment setup and other things we have to go through or other components. But probably we have completed 90% of UiPath capabilities. Just to add a note on that. So, সহজ ভাষায় বলতে গেলে তোমাদেরকে যখন ইন্টারভিউ কোশ্চেন করা হবে কোথাও, তখন এই যে চ্যাপ্টার গুলো আমরা কমপ্লিট করেছি,
Mustaq, the Dev is from Gujarat, so probably he will not understand Bengali.
No, it's so Dev, Hindi will work or English maybe?
Hindi or English, both will work.
Okay. So the thing is that आप लोगों को जब कोई कहीं पर भी आप इंटरव्यू देने जाओगे, रिगार्डिंग UiPath स्टूडियो से कोई अगर क्वेश्चन किया, तो ये जो हम लोग चैप्टर्स में कवर किया ना, 90% question will be from these particular chapters. So if you go for any particular interview, just go through the PPT. That will be enough for you, because we have given not only the key points, but also the detailed points about how it works, from where it works, and what are the properties we have so far for respective activities. So आप लोगों को ये easy होगा just to go through the properties or the PPTs. Sorry.
Yeah, I will keep that in mind. Thank you for the session.
No problem.
Any note, Joyda, Satyajit?
Joyda probably give you some insights that what are the question he is going to ask you on interview.
Live managerial round.
Yeah.
Jayada, you don't need to hire now, so you can ask anything.
Oh man, no, I think that's good. I think Apurva, maybe you can wrap it up.
Okay, so I think it's the duty of Abhishek. So I
Yeah,
just
I
pass the
know.
button to Abhishek.
Yeah. I was talking on mute actually.
Okay.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to thank Divjyoti for all the informative session and addressing all the queries very efficiently. And then a big thank to Apurva and congratulations to our Kolkata chapter for making this concept a reality. And thanks a lot to the Apurva so that with all your effort, means all the LinkedIn posts starting from the concept, you make the roadmap and then we walk through it. So it was a huge journey and I think it's a big success. We gain a success that all the college student and the people who try to reskill in this UiPath stick with us throughout this journey. So I think it's a huge success. And we had some wonderful feedback from the people that we are doing better than the paid courses. So I think that's a big compliment for us. So thanks everybody for staying with us. And Jayada, I think you were with us for all the sessions.
Yes.
You never missed any session. Yeah. Thanks for being such an inspiration because you inspire us for this. Yeah.
He was the inspector. He was checking that,
Yeah.
okay, is there any fault or something?
Live comment, live feedback. Yes. Yeah,
Is
so
it
that's all
possible?
from my side. Yes, Jim.
Can you share your LinkedIn ID, you and Divya Jyoti sir?
Yes, sure.
Thank you.
Yes, so that's all from my side, but Apurva, you can take the
No,
lead
so
now and
I will pass the
get started.
button to Joyda. So before passing this button to Joyda, so the thing is, so the means we are just a team. Okay, so I have done nothing, so it's a collective team effort. Okay, so without the good team or without the good people and who took all the responsibility, and the backup speakers are super amazing, that let's suppose for any day, so we are having some conversation that, okay, so I was means probably I would not be able to attend this session. Then there was backup speaker or backup moderator. Shantanu played a good role for just having 2 sessions as moderator, and there are backup sessions, backup speaker like Produman who just did for 1 session. Means instantly they just delivered these things. Okay, so without a good team, it was not possible for the UiPath Kolkata community, and that's it. So I just pass the button to Joyda.
Yeah,
Alright.
but you were the best captain I ever think.
That's okay. So no, it's fine. So thank you, everyone. I think all you have been very amazing. So that's all. So yeah, we will meet again. Happy to see all of you participating, and that's what we all are looking for. So thanks, everyone. Enjoy your rest of the day or night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good time.
Have a good night. Bye.
Thank you. Happy
Thank you.
automation.